Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. And this morning we'll be talking a little bit about the Sammappadhana, the four right efforts or the four aspects of right effort. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll give a short talk on the subject, and then take any questions that might come up. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, the topic for today is the four right efforts, what we call in the Noble Eightfold Path, it's Sammavayama, so the practice of right effort. It's also referred to as Sammappadhana, which is the four kinds of right exertion or right striving. So this is a topic which is, again, very central, very important in Buddhist practice. So I had spoken about this a little bit yesterday in the context of the five indriyas, the five spiritual faculties. Today I'd like to focus in a bit more on the standard Pali formula for describing Sammappadhana, the right exertions. So drawing from this description that we find in many places in the suttas. So the Buddha gives the four aspects of right effort using a standard description. So the first one, so he says, Anupannanang papakanang akusalanang dhammanang anupadaya chandang janeti vayamati viryang arabati chittang paganhati parahati. So this description, so starting at the beginning, so anupannanang, so upanna means something that has arisen, something that's come into being. So anupanna means something which has not yet arisen, something which has not yet appeared or not yet manifested in the mind. And papaka, so the word papa means evil or harmful. And akusala, so kusala means wholesome, beneficial. So akusala means unwholesome, unbeneficial. And dhamma, so dhamma here has its meaning of mental phenomena or phenomena in general. So then anupananang papakanang akusalanang dhammanang means of dhammas, of things which have not yet arisen, which are harmful and unwholesome. Then the Buddha says that we should anupadaya, so for their non-arising, chandang janeti. So we spoke a bit about chanda the other day when talking about the iddhipadas. So the first of the iddhipadas is chanda, so bringing up this interest or enthusiasm for doing something as being the necessary first step for any Buddhist practice. One must first produce chanda. One must first have this interest in engaging in the practice. So here also, in talking about how to practice right effort, well, the first thing the Buddha says is that one should chandang janeti. So janeti literally means give birth to. So it's from the same root ja, from which we get words like jati and jata. So janeti means give birth to. So literally he's saying we should chandang janeti, we should give birth to chanda. We should produce this interest or enthusiasm in the mind for the non-arising of any kind of harmful, unwholesome state which has not yet arisen. And further, he says vayamati, so we should make an effort. So the verb vayamati, it comes from the root v, which just means to move or to go. So vayamati means making a movement. So this is not then a passive thing. So this is actually a very active verb that the Buddha is using here. So we're not just kind of sitting back and waiting for the mind to magically become pure all by itself, but we're actually making an effort to cultivate purity of mind. Next he says, viryang arabati. So virya, also we spoke a bit about yesterday. Virya has the quality of heroic effort. So this heroic endeavor to achieve something of significance. So virya we normally translate as energy. So viryang arabati. Arabati means to initiate, to produce, to set into motion, to get started with. So viryang arabati. So we should produce a lot of energy for the non-arising of unarisen harmful states of mind. Next it says chittang paganhati. So chitta means the mind. So the normal usage of this word, meaning the mind. And paganhati, literally paganhati means to grab, to take hold of. So chittang paganhati means taking hold of the mind. So taking control of the mind. So again, this is a very active way of speaking about practice. So not a passive approach to the mind, but rather the Buddha is saying we should seize hold of the mind in order to control the mind so that it doesn't produce any kind of harmful mental states. And the final verb that the Buddha uses here is padahati, which is the present tense form of padhana. So padhana means striving or endeavoring. So padahati means one strives or one endeavors. So effectively what the Buddha is giving here is a string of verbs which all have a connotation of a sincere, concentrated, focused effort that one is making in order to control the mind. So chandang janeti, one produces interest. Vayamati, one makes a movement towards doing something. Viryang arabati, one produces energy. Chittang paganhati, one seizes hold of the mind. So taking control of the mind. And padahati, one strives, one exerts oneself, one endeavors. And endeavors for the anupadaya, the non-arising, of anupananang papakanang akusalanang dhammanang, of mind states which have not arisen, which are harmful and unwholesome. So that's the first right effort. So briefly speaking, it's taking control of our mind and making a sincere, ongoing effort to prevent harmful mind states from arising. The second right effort is upananang papakanang akusalanang dhammanang pahanaya chandang janeti vayamati viryang arabati chittang paganhati padahati. So here the string of verbs is the same, but the object here is upananang papakanang akusalanang dhammanang. So harmful, unwholesome states which have already arisen. And one is making an effort, pahanaya. So pahanaya means for the discarding or abandoning or casting away. So it's from the pahana, the root here is ha, which means to throw or discard, and pa means away. So pahana means throwing away, discarding. So again, one is chandang janeti, producing interest. Vayamati, putting forth effort. Viryang arabati, producing energy. Chittang paganhati, seizing control of the mind. And padahati, so endeavoring or striving. for the abandoning, pahanaya, of arisen, harmful, unwholesome states, upananang, papakanang, akusalanang, dhammanang. So this is the second one. If we notice that there's any unwholesome states in the mind, then we seize control of the mind and make this heroic effort to try to discard whatever unwholesome states are currently present. Then the third of the four right efforts in Pali, this one says, Anupananang kusalanang dhammanang upadaya chandang janeti vayamati viryang arabati chittang paganhati parahati. So here the object the Buddha is giving, anupananang, so unarisen, kusalanang dhammanang, wholesome states of mind. So for any wholesome states of mind which are not present, the Buddha says we should chandang janeti, produce an interest, vayamati, put forward effort, viryang arabati, arouse energy, chittang paganhati, seize control of the mind, parahati, and strive for their arising, for upadaya, so for the arising of wholesome states which are not arisen. And then the final of the four is upananang kusalanang dhammanang titya asammosaya biyo bhavaya vepulaya bhavanaya paripurya chandang janeti vayamati viryang arabati chittang paganhati padhati. So here the Buddha is saying, so for upananang kusalanang dhammanang, so for wholesome mind states which have already arisen, so for example, if you're looking at your mind and you notice that you've got a little bit of metta, to pick an example of a wholesome mind state, you've got a little bit of loving kindness in your mind. Well, then the Buddha says we should be chandang janeti, producing interest, vayamati, putting forward effort, viryang arabati, arousing energy, chittang paganhati, taking hold of the mind, parahati, and endeavoring for titiya, so for the stabilizing of those wholesome states. So the word titi literally means to stand, so standing still, in the sense that it's not going anywhere. So keeping it stable, making it stay where it is. So titiya, so for the stabilizing or maintaining. Asammosaya. Sammosa means to forget something or to let something fade away. So asammosaya means for the non-fading, non-dispersion, non-forgetting of those wholesome states of mind. So again, maybe you recognize that you've got a wholesome state present, you've got a little bit of metta, and you're like, okay, I don't want to lose this. I want to stabilize it. I want to keep it present. I don't want to let it fade away or disperse. And next, the Buddha says, biyo bhavaya. So biyo means more, and bhava means to become. So biyo bhavaya means we want to make it become more. We want to increase it. We want to make it even bigger, even better. So we're like, okay, I've got a little bit of metta. Let's make it even bigger, even better. So we should strive for biyo bhavaya, for making it even bigger and better. And the next one, vepulaya. So vepula means abundant, vast. So we should make it abundant and vast. So again, it's like you've got like this little like spark of metta somewhere in the corner of your mind. It's like just a little bit. It's like, well, let's make it abundant. Let's flood the mind with this bright, beautiful state. Bhavanaya. So bhavana means to develop. So it literally means bringing into being. But it also has the sense of bringing something to its full development. So we should be working to constantly cultivate and develop and improve. That would be another way of translating bhavana, is improving. So constantly trying to develop and improve whatever wholesome state is currently present. So for example, maybe you have a little bit of metta, but only for your cat. It's like, well, okay, that's a lot better than no metta at all. But let's try to improve that. So what's better than having metta only for your cat? Maybe having metta for your cat and your mom. Okay, that's progress. We're making it a little bit better. We're improving it. Let's keep going. Maybe you can also have metta for your sister. Maybe that's a stretch. But you keep working on trying to improve it and develop it. Until optimally we come to the final adjective, so paripurya. So pari means complete, and pura means perfect or full. So paripura means completely full, completely perfect. So it's reached its highest pinnacle of perfection. So we should be, again, when we notice any wholesome state present in the mind, then we should make an effort, first off, to keep it there. So keep it stable. Then asamosaya, don't let it disperse or fade away. So the first thing is just like, okay, I've got something good. Let's not let this disappear. Next, biobhavaya, we should work to increase it. Okay, we've got a little bit. Let's keep it here and let's make it a little bit more. Vepulaya, we should make it abundant. Bhavanaya, we should improve it. We should develop it. We should try to bring it closer to paripurya. We should try to bring it all the way to its highest complete perfection, its complete fullness. Trying to bring it to its pinnacle. And of course, the Buddha gives the usual string of verbs. So chandang janeti vayamati viryang arabati chetang paganhati parahati. So putting all four of these together, then we have a basic roadmap for how to deal with the mind. So we should be constantly observing our mind, constantly watching what mental states are present in the mind, and constantly watching what's going on, what choices and decisions we're making, what's appearing and vanishing in the mind. So if there's currently no unwholesome state present in the mind, well, we should be making an effort to keep it that way. So this is the first critical effort, is we want to prevent unwholesome states from arising in the mind. So maybe right now there's no greed in the mind. Well, then let's keep it that way. Let's try to keep greed from appearing in the mind. We notice there's no aversion in the mind. Well, let's keep it that way. Let's try to avoid doing anything that's going to lead to an arising of greed or aversion in the mind. And if we're going into a situation where greed and aversion might appear, so for example, you're about to walk into the kitchen, and that's a situation where greed might arise for you. Well, then before walking in the kitchen, you steel yourself. It's like, okay, difficult situation coming. I need to make an effort to carefully protect my mind from the arising of greed. I know I'm about to enter into a greed-provoking situation. I need to make sure to keep things under control. Or you have to interact with somebody who's really annoying, and you're like, okay, I need to be really careful here. This is the kind of person who tends to really spark my dosa. So I need to really carefully watch my mind, really carefully maintain my purity of mind as I move into this situation. Or maybe you're going into a situation where you tend to space out and get distracted and think about silly things. It's like, well, okay, I need to stay really firmly rooted in mindfulness of the body so that I don't drift off into la-la land. I need to really keep firmly grounded in right here in this physical experience. Keep the mind stable. And as we're watching the mind, if we do notice that we're starting to engage in some kind of unwholesome mental activity or some kind of unwholesome mind state is starting to take root, then we should make a conscious effort to eliminate it as quickly as possible. So for this, I actually really like the phrasing that the Buddha uses in the Sabbasava Sutta. Is it Sabbasava Sutta? Yeah, Sabbasava Sutta, where the Buddha says that when any unwholesome mind state is present, then we should destroy it. We should annihilate it. We should render it completely non-existent. So again, this is, the Buddha uses these very strong verbs. These verbs are, which are indicating that we should be attentive to the fires of the mind as something dangerous, which need to be extinguished as quickly as possible. So if your house catches fire, you don't just kind of sit back and like, everything's fine, I'm just going to be mindful while the house burns down. No, you're like, wow, this is really dangerous. And if I don't do something about this fire right away, then it's probably just going to keep getting worse. And it's probably going to cause a tremendous amount of damage. Might set fire to somebody else's house too. It might burn down the whole city if I'm not careful. So it's like, wait a minute, right now, while the fire is still small, I'm going to make an effort to extinguish it as quickly as possible. And it's the same with our mind. If we can catch unwholesome mind states while they're still small and weak, then it's much easier to extinguish them. If we wait until the whole house is burning, then it's a little bit more difficult. And the end result is usually much messier. So you want to try to deal with unwholesome mind states as quickly as possible while they're still fresh and weak. And similarly, we make an effort to produce wholesome mind states. So this is actually the ongoing practice that we do, particularly during meditation, but actually every moment of the day. We're always trying to produce wholesome mind states, always trying to bring the mind into a wholesome condition. So I gave the example earlier of metta. So one of the classic wholesome states of mind that we try to cultivate in every waking moment. Also sati, mindfulness, we're constantly trying to produce. During meditation practice, we're often trying to produce samadhi, so another very wholesome mind state. Or upekkha, equanimity. Again, all day long, we're trying to cultivate this mind of equanimity. So making this effort to bring into being wholesome states of mind. And then again, the fourth right effort is once we have some kind of wholesome mind state present, then we work to keep it. We try to stabilize it, to maintain it. And we try to increase it, to develop it, to improve it, and bring it to its fullest perfection. So this again is a way of understanding the training of the mind that we engage in moment by moment in Buddhist practice. So that's a summary of the 4 right efforts, the Sammappadhana. So I think that's enough for now. Sadhu, 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 anumodami. So at this time, if there's any questions or comments, I can take questions. First off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Vivian, Jessica, Sumashwat, Yankee, Mew, Jessica, Manal, Bhumika, Dan, Jayanta, and Amaranta. And I see one question here. Please go ahead. Yeah.
2 questions came up.
One at a time, or I'll forget the first one.
When we're, you've mentioned that when we're cultivating wholesome states, you use the analogy of taking a vaccine is better than applying a Band-Aid. As I understood it, like developing metta before anger arises, not using metta as like a balm for the sting of anger. Could you talk more about that? And the second question is one at a time. Okay.
Otherwise, by the time you're done with the second question, I'll have forgotten the first one. So yes, so it's generally better. So you'll notice that the Buddha starts by saying, try to prevent unwholesome states from arising in the first place. So that's generally easier. So when your mind is in a neutral condition, keeping it in a neutral condition is relatively straightforward. somewhat. And also starting with that blank slate, you can produce a wholesome mind state. But once the mind has already fallen into an unwholesome state, then trying to switch directly to a wholesome state is quite challenging. It's a much bigger step. And even just trying to get the mind back to a neutral state is relatively challenging. So the idea is like from a neutral state, you bring the mind into metta and you try to keep it in metta all the time. Then for it to slip from metta all the way down into dosa is a big step. So that's much less likely to happen. What's more likely is you'll notice that your metta is starting to weaken and you're slipping back to a neutral state. And then you're like, okay, danger zone. I'm starting to lose my wholesome mind state. I need to do something about this. So this is why I said that it's usually better to inoculate the mind against the arising of anger in the first place. But once the mind is already in an aversive condition, then you still need to do something, and you need to do something as soon as possible. If your metta practice is very strong, then sometimes you can just go directly into metta. But often what's useful is to do something tangential first, something that just gets your mind off the aversion, doing something completely different with the mind for a few seconds at least, just to break the pattern of the aversion and try to like get the mind back to a more neutral condition. Then you can produce metta. So for example, if I notice that I'm in an aversive condition, then usually my first step is not to do metta, it's to come back to mindfulness of the body. And then after doing mindfulness of the body for a few seconds, then I'll start practicing metta. But that first step of just kind of like sidestepping with the mind is usually more effective than trying to go into an exact opposite mind state. But your mileage may vary. This is the way that I was taught, and this is what usually works for me. But it's always good to experiment with different things and see what works for you. Do you have anything you want to add to that? And second question.
Oh yeah. I have three. The original question was when we're cultivating the 7 factors of awakening, is that automatically going to reduce the 5 hindrances, or is that a separate practice? We need to consciously focus on the 5 hindrances coming and developing the 7, or when we cultivate the 7, the 5 decrease. Is that clear?
I would say, generally speaking, when you cultivate the 7, that the 5 decrease. Generally speaking, they're often described as being opposites of each other.
So the better attitude would be not to search for the 5 hindrances, but to constantly keep the 7 factors in mind.
Both are important.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. And Jayanta says, "Hi, Ayasoma. Nice to hear your voice."
Hello, Jayanta.
And Bhavani says, "What is the difference between Chanda and Chandima Raja?" Well, they're completely different word roots. So Chanda is interest or enthusiasm or desire to do something, or motivation, motive. Whereas Chandima Raja, I assume that in this case, I believe it's the word for moon, in which case there would be no H in the spelling. It would just be Canda, Chanda, in the sense of moon. So pronunciation is very similar, but they're pronounced slightly differently and spelled a little bit differently. And Dan says, "You mentioned a situation where greed could arise or ill will could arise. How would you know of the potential of delusion arising?" So as always, this is the most difficult state. So I have deep compassion for delusion types because you've got your work cut out for you. It's quite difficult. So usually what you're going to be watching for is a weakening of mindfulness. And what you're going to be watching for is when the sharpness and precision of your, particularly mindfulness of the body, starts to blur or fade. And you're going to be watching for stories appearing in the mind. For a delusion type, usually the most important ongoing moment-to-moment practice is to keep constant, sharp, detailed, precise mindfulness of the body, and to keep the mind completely silent. So delusion breeds in noise. Delusion breeds in stories. So you want to keep stories out of the mind. Don't let the mind go into storytelling, because when you go into storytelling, then that's when you'll start drifting off into fantasy land. And also, as soon as you notice that the sharpness and precision of your body mindfulness is starting to fade, then that's also a sign that the mind is starting to drift into that hazy, blurry state where it's prone to moha. So again, keeping that constant grasp of sharp, detailed, precise mindfulness of the body. That will help to give you a constant clue as to when the mind is starting to slip into a moha condition. And don't see any other questions online. Anything else from here? Yeah, go ahead.
Hooking up was when working with sloth and torpor and restlessness. I feel like when applying energy for sloth and torpor, it can then go into restlessness. And then if you try to be too calm and you're fall asleep. So like those two seem to be related more than, let's say, than other ones in terms of how we keep a balance of awake but calm. Like awake but not like that. It seems like the most that needs the balancing. Would you have advice for that?
Yeah, and you just have to keep experimenting with that and paying attention. There is a perfect balance point in the middle. But you're going to be spending a lot of time either overshooting or undershooting. You're going to spend a lot of your time either going too far into energy and making the mind agitated, or going too far into tranquility and making the mind sleepy. So you're going to spend a lot of time missing the mark on that one. But as time goes by, you become increasingly calibrated to understanding where that mark is, where the mind is completely alert and awake, but not agitated, where the mind is very peaceful and still, but not dull and sleepy. But in the beginning, and beginning usually means the first 10 years or so, in the beginning, we're always going to be missing that mark. We're always going to be either jumping into agitation or falling into dullness. And you just keep yo-yoing between these extremes until eventually your mind starts to discover that lovely midpoint. And once you start to touch into that midpoint more and more frequently, then you'll understand more clearly what it is, and it becomes much easier. But this, again, it usually takes years. It doesn't happen quickly. And I see another question here. So Richard says, is arousing energy similar to having enthusiasm? Yes. Yeah. So you can actually deliberately produce enthusiasm for something. Interest, enthusiasm, these are things which can be produced. As the Buddha is saying, chandang janeti, you produce an interest in doing this. So it's like you're sitting here and it's like, well, what do I want to be interested in? Do I want to be interested in watching reruns of Game of Thrones? Well, you can produce interest in that. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do that. Do I want to produce interest in taking a nap? Well, again, you could. That's something you could do. Or do you want to produce interest in cultivating wholesome mind states? And that seems like a good idea. So you can produce interest in whatever you want. You can make the mind enthusiastic about whatever you want to make the mind enthusiastic about. So it's a matter of putting forth, taking control of your own mind and pointing it towards what you want it to be pointed towards. And Jessica says, beginning equals 10 years. Thank you. I am at 8 years. Not there yet. LOL. Okay, keep going. 2 years left. And then another 10 years. So that's the last of the questions. You have a question? Go ahead.
Yes. In regards to this cultivation and development of the mind, and even mentioning the 10-year mark, there's, I guess it goes back to yesterday's talk and the big component where an understanding about yourself, right? And your own journey and your own shortcomings, you may not be able to get to a certain point. Is that correct? Because sometimes I'm pushing myself to have greater equanimity, to develop that metta within myself, these type of states, but I feel like no matter how hard I try, I can't get there. And actually maybe forcing it is creating the opposite effect because I'm so wanting to grasp that. And it's cultivating this tension within myself and sort of disappointment with myself. Is that correct? Like how does one balance that sort of state?
I mean, this all sounds perfectly normal. So in the course of producing art practice, then in the beginning we're just kind of flailing around trying to figure out how this works. Like you're handed this mind, but it didn't come with an instruction manual. So do they even do instruction manuals anymore?
It's all online.
It's all online. Yeah.
There's
So, and well, actually, fortunately, we do have an instruction manual for the mind, but it's written in Pali. And it's a little bit cryptic at times. Anyway, so not to overextend the metaphor. So you have this mind, but it doesn't come with an instruction manual. So you have to try to figure out how everything works. So in the beginning, we're just kind of like hitting buttons at random and seeing what happens. But through observing the cause and effect process, then we start to get a better understanding of how the mind works and how to produce wholesome mind states and what the various kinds of wholesome states feel like. And also we get a deeper understanding of, again, how to purify and develop, how to improve and perfect these various wholesome mind states. And also we start to understand where we make mistakes. So where we push the mind in an unhelpful or even counterproductive direction. So a lot of this just comes through the process of experimentation and observation. So your mind is your own laboratory to try to figure out how to attain awakening. And the Buddha gave some very useful guidance, but you still need to figure out the particulars of how to apply that to your own specific conditions. So the Buddha's guidelines, by necessity, are relatively generalized because they're designed to be applicable to everybody in every mode of life, in every point in time, in every location. So the Buddha gave very generalized advice, which is part of why it survived 2,500 years, because it is designed to be applicable to absolutely everybody in every situation. But that does mean that you need to figure out the specifics for yourself, because it's going to be slightly different for you than it is for any other particular individual. The general principles will be exactly the same, but the specific details will vary a bit from person to person. So, I mean, it sounds to me like you're working through that process of flailing around and mashing buttons at random and seeing what happens, and you're starting to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So I would say just keep going. You're on the right general track. You just keep going and keep observing, and you'll start to figure out what needs to be adjusted. Okay? And Dan says, I think I just realized I may be a delusion type, LOL. Yes, you're a delusion type. And Jay has an off-topic question, which would be great for Monk Chat this evening. So Jay Bowen, please bring your question to Monk Chat this evening. And you have another question?
Yeah, when I was starting to learn, I was taught a Tibetan style of visualizing the Buddha above the head and pouring light and nectar into the body.
Mhm.
And what I've learned studying from the Theravada tradition, I was trying to break it down and see what like the root of it is. Nectar is supposed to be soothing, and light is supposed to be awakening and focusing on an image of recollecting the Buddha is keeping us focused, mindful on an object and a wholesome object. So nectar really just means calming the body, that's tranquility, and light is alert. So when we cultivate the perceptions of light and nectar, we're trying to be awake and calm. So that's what they're trying to tell us in a creative way. Is that how I understand the...
I mean, whenever it comes to describing Tibetan Buddhist practices, I'm really not the best person to ask, but I like the explanation you just gave. That sounds pretty good. Yeah. Okay. Maybe enough for today. So we can end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you this evening for monk chat.